So when we saw this little video clip, we thought, wow, this really fits with what's going on with the journey. And so one of the reasons we made this journey across the United States is we think it's important that we tell the story of the boarding school. Don't have somebody else tell the story about what happened to us. Too often we have they talk about us without us, and then what happens is it's not the right story. Then they start teaching the school, and heads down, class to class to class, and pretty soon we start believing the truth about the lie. And so, what we want to take a few minutes here and ask Marlon to come up here to tell you is to tell you what we heard the people say. Indian version of the boarding school. The lessons that we heard again and again and again. Never let anyone know that this didn't happen, so it doesn't happen again. So they understand their parents. I never understood my dad until I understood what happened to him in the boarding school. I hated him. But once I got to understand what happened to him, then I had something to work with. Because that was his best shot. So this is Marlon Farley from White Earth, and he's traveled the whole journey here with us.
I think Don said it earlier that, what we heard from our elders, probably foremost, and a message that is, I think, very, very obvious and has become very prevalent, that those boarding schools survivors that spoke to us on this journey, what they talked about is that they didn't know how to love. And then there was a woman here, a friend of mine, her name is Amy Walker, she's from Cherokee, she drove all the way from North Carolina. And she reminded us that another thing that happened is that we didn't learn how to love ourselves. And then we passed that on to our children, being passed on to the grandchildren and through the generations as we know it. The boarding school survivors they talked about, as they got into that school, like Dennis talked about in this video, was that first thing that would happen is that they would be on a long journey to that school, not knowing where they were going. And if you think about it, how traumatic would that be, just to be away from, stripped out of your home, from the love of your parents, grandparents, your loved ones, and then to go on a journey somewhere in wagons, somewhere transported in various ways, far distance away from home, so that trauma began from day one. As they got into the school, as Dennis also said, the hair was cut, DDT was put in, harsh chemicals were put in, and the scalp was burned. Many of our elders talked about, and the next thing is that government-issued clothing was put on you, and your moccasins were taken off, and for many of the elders, they remember probably the harshest thing about that day was having to put their feet into government-issued shoes that were oftentimes too small, they curled their toes. If they spoke in a language, we know that many of those stories were very horrid what happened. Don talked about cutting off fingers. Many of our elders, they talked about having to kneel on broomsticks for hours. Some talked about having to kneel on pebbles, marbles, white rice for several hours for speaking the language. Many were beaten. On that very first day of school, as they would come in, many talked about a gauntlet. Now this gauntlet was boys, girls, lined up on both sides, and you as a new student would have to go through that gauntlet, and then you were whipped by the other students. Now if you didn't hit hard enough that new student, then you would go through the gauntlet yourself. Many of our elders, they talked about the harsh punishments that occur for just making a simple mistake as children do. They talked about being wrapped in wet sheets and whipped with leather straps. many of our elders, they talk about that there, in some of these schools, that the matrons, that they were very, very cruel, but that also that the matrons had trained the older students to be very harsh disciplinarians as well. So we know that we were trained, Native people were trained to be harsh to children in those schools, and then, of course, we passed that on. On this journey, our veterans spoke. Many of our veterans, they told their story. I remember Tommy, and when we were in Anadarko, he told the story that by the time that he got to military, he said he was a very good Marine on the day he walked into the service because he'd really been broken down. He had been harshly disciplined. There was nothing that the drill sergeant could do to harm them. In fact, the drill sergeants in the military said, leave those Indians alone. They're already broken down. We don't even have to work those guys. So we also believe that there was a recruitment of our males as we travel across the country, that a lot of the veterans, they talked about that they were recruited right out of that boarding school. And it became a very easy transition for them. And many of them said it was very easy to be hated, to be hateful. When they went into war, they had no problem hating because they already been taught that. When we were in Albuquerque, New Mexico, there was a study that was conducted. This story was shared by Evelyn Blanchard. She talked about the matrons a little bit, and she said that as they interviewed through a study the matrons, is that through this study, the psychologists reported that many of the matrons, they were brittle, they were insensitive, they were cruel. And this is the kicker, is that most of them were boarding school, they're products of boarding school. Their parents had gone through the boarding school, and they kind of grew up in that system. So many of the matrons that were in those schools, they already had the teachings of not loving, not caring, not being lovable to our people, and they learned very well how to discipline our people. I think that as we travel across the country, as well as that we learn that this system was designed to break down the family, and how they did that is that we heard from many of our elders that all of their siblings had gone to that school, and for years they were not allowed to see their siblings. So they put the girls on one side, the boys on the next side, and then they were separated and they weren't even allowed to talk to each other. We heard elders talk about it wasn't until they were 50s and 60s years old is when they first established a relationship with their own sibling. These are just some of the traumas, and there's several other stories about the trauma, but in terms of what we learn about healing, I believe one of the things that was very, very prevalent was an elder, his name was Sid White from Flanders, South Dakota. He said this, is that the Creator has given us all a common gift, and that gift is love. And he said it's to love God is to respect that gift that He's given us all, and that is to use that love as we heal. In White Earth, Minnesota, on our reservation back home, is what we learned, is that we know that as we traveled to the schools and we went to the cemeteries, is that there was a lot of those little spirits that were still there. Their spirits are still there, we know that. The community will say that they can still hear the voices of those little ones, and they would cry out, help me, help me. You could hear the cries through the walls of the jail cells and dungeons. But our elders back home, they said that there was a ceremony that would be conducted, that if you would just make available that sweat lodge ceremony in the evening, and you could just make that available, is that what they found out is that many of those little ones, they perished. They didn't have a belief system when they died. Many of them died at a very, very early age. We found many of the grave sites, they didn't even have their names on it. They were marked as unknown. And what our healers are saying is that if we just make that ceremony available to those little ones so that they can get a faith about Creator, is that they can